The air at the Miller farm auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late August dust, diesel fumes, and the sweet, cloying smell of financial desperation. Men stood in tight knots, their faces grim under the brims of their seed corn caps. They kicked at the tires of machinery that had seen better days, their low murmurs a funeral dirge for a family's dream. This was 1974, and while the papers were screaming about high grain prices and a farming boom, the vultures were still circling. A bad year, a sick wife, one too many loans from the bank in town. That's all it took. I stood back by the fence line, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn denim overalls, feeling the familiar grit of dried soil under my fingernails. My name is Silas Blackwood. My land, the quarter section my grandfather broke with a team of mules, was 3 miles down this same gravel road. It was paid for. Every bolt in my barn, every shingle on my roof, every acre of black dirt was mine, free and clear. My father had hammered that lesson into me with the same steady force he used to drive a fence post. Debt, son, is a chain. You don't see it, but the banker holds the other end. That's why I was here. Not for the land, the bank already had its claws in that, but for the tools. A man could always find a bargain at a heartbreak sale. I had my eye on a New Holland bale wagon. Mine was a tired old thing, and fixing the knotters one more time felt like a punishment I didn't deserve. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant, a hypnotic staccato rhythm, echoed across the yard. Got a $50 bid, now 60, 60. Will you give me 60? $60 bid, now 70. He was selling off hand tools now, coffee cans full of mismatched bolts and rusty wrenches. The main event was yet to come. That's when I saw him. Dale Bishop. He wasn't watching the auctioneer. He was strolling through the equipment line like a king surveying his domain. Bishop was 10 years younger than me, all ambition and polished cowboy boots. He'd taken over his father's 80 acres 5 years back, and had already leveraged it into nearly 1,000. He farmed with a checkbook, not his hands. Everything he owned was brand new, painted in the gleaming red of International Harvester, and carried a lien from the Farmers' Trust Bank downtown. He stopped beside the centerpiece of the sale, a John Deere 4430 tractor. It was only 2 years old, the paint still bright, the cab windows clean, a sign of the times. Miller had stretched too far, bought the new tractor thinking the good times would last forever. They never do. Bishop ran a hand over the fender, a smirk playing on his lips. He saw me watching him and sauntered over, his boots crunching on the dry gravel. "Mornin', Silas," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Come to pick over the bones." "Just lookin', Dale," I said, my voice flat. "That old 40-20 of yours still runnin'?" he asked, nodding his head back in the direction of my farm. "Heard you were rebuilding the injector pump yourself last spring. Must have saved a whole $50. I didn't rise to the bait. My John Deere fought out at 20 was a 1968 model. It didn't have a cab or a radio, just a canvas sunshade I put on in June and took off in October. But I knew every inch of that diesel engine. I'd adjusted its valves, timed its injection, and could feel when it was running right just by the vibration coming up through the steel seat pan. It didn't owe me a dime. "She runs fine," I said. "Yeah, well, fine doesn't cut it anymore," Bishop scoffed. "This is the big leagues now. You gotta spend money to make money. Get big or get out. Earl Butts himself said so." He clapped a hand on the 4430's big rear tire. "This is what a real farmer drives. Air conditioning, power shift transmission. I can plow 100 acres and still listen to the ball game without breaking a sweat. You're still wrestling that old synchro-range gear jammer like your granddaddy did." The auctioneer moved on to a grain drill, A few local farmers started bidding, their voices hesitant. "They're selling the South 80 next," Bishop said, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial tone. "Good, flat ground, drains well. Be a nice addition to my operation." I knew the parcel. It bordered my west fence line. I'd always thought that if I ever expanded, that's where I'd do it. But I'd do it with cash, saved up over 5 or 6 good years. I had about half of what it was worth, tucked away in a savings account at that very same farmer's trust. "Thinking of bidding?" I asked, keeping my face a mask. He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Thinking. Silas, I already bought it, got the loan approved yesterday. This is just a formality for the court." He winked. "The bank and I have an understanding. They know who the progressive farmers are in this county." My gut tightened. He was buying land with money that didn't exist, backed by the inflated value of other land he hadn't paid for yet. It was a house of cards, and the whole county was starting to look like it was built on the same flimsy foundation. "Good for you, Dale," I said, turning my back on him and walking away. His laughter followed me, but I drowned it out with the auctioneer's drone. I stayed long enough to see the South 80 go to Bishop on the first and only bid, a formality just as he'd said. I didn't even bother waiting for the bail wagon. The whole place suddenly felt tainted. As I drove my old Ford pickup down the road, the dust cloud from Bishop's shiny new Lincoln Continental billowed past me, heading back toward town to sign more papers. I turned into my own lane, the familiar crunch of the gravel under my tires a comforting sound. There she sat, behind the barn. My combine. A 1965 John Deere 95 with the round-back grain tank. She wasn't pretty. The green paint was faded to a pale olive, and rust bloomed around the bolt heads. The cab was a clattering, dusty box of heat in September. But like my 40-20, she was mine. Every belt, every bearing, every chain was paid for. And as I looked at her, I felt a stubborn sense of pride. Bishop could have his air conditioning and his bank loans. I had this. I had freedom. Now, before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you something. Take a look back at your own life, or the lives of your parents and grandparents. Have you ever had to choose between the shiny and new that comes with a payment book and the old and reliable that's already paid for? Whether it was a car, a house, or a tool, which path did you take? Let me know in the comments below, because that choice is the very heart of this story. It's the choice that separated the survivors from the ghosts in the winter that was coming. The years between 74 and 78 were a blur of hard work and high prices. The Russian grain deal had sent corn and soybean prices into the stratosphere. Land values doubled, then doubled again. It seemed like the good times would never end. Dale Bishop became the golden boy of the county. He bought another tractor, a massive 4-wheel drive Steiger, the kind of machine that could pull a 12-bottom plow and change the face of the earth. He put up massive grain bins, all gleaming corrugated steel, and bought a brand new International 1460 axial flow combine. It was a monster, a red beast that could chew through a cornfield twice as fast as my old 95. The talk at the co-op was all about Bishop. Did you see Dale's new rig? Got stereo and everything. Heard he picked up the old Henderson place. Paid cash. They didn't know it wasn't cash. It was bank paper. But in those days it looked the same. And they talked about me, too. But their words had a different edge. Old Silas is still tinkering with that museum piece. He's missing the boat. Could have doubled his acreage by now if he wasn't so scared of the bank. They'd look at my old pickup, my faded overalls, and then at Bishop's new Lincoln, and they'd shake their heads. I was a relic, a stubborn fool standing in the way of progress. My wife, Martha, felt it too. She was a good woman, a farm wife through and through, but the whispers got to her. One night, after a church supper, where everyone had been congratulating Dale's wife on their new house, Martha sat at our kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. "Silas," she said quietly, not looking at me. "Are we doing the right thing? The Bishops have a new home, 2 new cars. Peggy Bishop was wearing a diamond necklace tonight. All I see for us is more work and more grease under your fingernails." I pulled up a chair across from her and took her hand. It was rough and calloused, just like mine. "Martha, their house has a mortgage. Their cars have loans. That combine has a lien on it so big it would choke a horse. We have this." I gestured around the simple kitchen. "It's ours. No banker can walk in here tomorrow and take it away. That's a different kind of wealth. It's peace of mind." She squeezed my hand, but didn't look convinced. "I hope you're right, Silas. I truly do." The pressure was immense. Every time I went to the parts store, the owner would try to sell me on a new line of credit. The banker who used to just nod at me in the street now called me by my first name, inviting me into his office to talk about expansion opportunities. I was a holdout, an anomaly in a world drunk on easy credit. My biggest test came during the harvest of '77. It was a wet fall. The corn was holding a lot of moisture, and the ground was soft. It was tough on machinery. I was halfway through my last field of beans, the one bordering the 80 acres Bishop had bought at the auction, when it happened. There was a loud bang from the guts of the John Deere 95, a sound like a gunshot, followed by a high-pitched metallic scream and the sickening grind of tortured steel. I slammed the separator control lever forward, shutting everything down. The engine coughed to a stop, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the rustle of the wind through the uncut soybeans. I climbed down from the cab, my heart sinking into my boots. I knew that sound. It wasn't a broken belt or a slipped chain. It was something deep, something expensive. I spent an hour pulling off inspection plates and guards, my hands covered in a thick paste of grease and bean dust. And then I found it. The main separator shaft, a thick piece of hardened steel that ran the width of the machine and drove the straw walkers, had sheared clean in 2. The bearing on the right side had seized, heating the shaft until it became brittle and finally gave way under the strain. It was a catastrophic failure. The flailing end of the broken shaft had done more damage, bending 2 of the straw walkers and punching a hole in the side of the sheet metal housing. My harvest was over. I sat on the ground, my back against the big rear tire, and just stared at the mechanical carnage. A feeling of pure, cold despair washed over me. It was the middle of October. I still had 80 acres of corn to bring in. The weather was turning. Hiring a custom harvester would cost a fortune, eating up most of the profit from that field. Just then, I heard the powerful thrum of a big diesel engine. Over the rise, Dale Bishop's brand new IH 1460 appeared, its huge 20-foot grain head eating a massive swathe of beans. He was working the field he'd bought out from under me. He saw my combine sitting silent and angled his machine over toward the fence line. He shut down his header but kept the engine running, the cab door swinging open with a hydraulic hiss. He leaned out, cupping a hand to his mouth. "Having some trouble there, Silas," he yelled over the engine's roar. "Broke a shaft," I hollered back, not bothering to hide the disgust in my voice. "Well, I'd offer to help, but I'm running behind myself," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "This new machine is so fast, I took on another 200 acres of custom work over by the river. Gotta make those payments, you know." He gave me a sarcastic little wave, sealed himself back inside his air-conditioned cab, and roared away, leaving me in a cloud of diesel smoke and chaff. The humiliation burned hotter than the frustration. He was right. His new machine was working, earning money, and mine was a dead hunk of iron in the middle of a muddy field. For the first time, I felt a flicker of doubt. Was my father's way, my way, truly the right one? Was I just a stubborn old fool destined to be left behind? I spent the next 2 days tearing that combine apart. The work was brutal. Bolts that hadn't been turned in a decade were frozen with rust. I heated them with an acetylene torch until they glowed cherry red, then beat on them with a 3-pound sledgehammer and a long-handled wrench. I laid on my back in the mud and grime, with dirt and rust flakes falling into my eyes. Every muscle in my body ached. The shaft itself was a nightmare. It was over 10 feet long and weighed hundreds of pounds. I had to rig up a chain hoist from the limb of a nearby oak tree just to get it out of the machine. I loaded it onto my pickup and drove the 30 miles to the John Deere dealership in the county seat. The parts man, a young kid with slicked-back hair, looked at the sheared shaft and whistled. "Wow, haven't seen one of these go on a 95 in years." He tapped a few keys on his new microfiche reader, a fancy new contraption that was supposed to make finding parts easier. He frowned. "Uh-oh. What is it?" I asked, my stomach clenching. "Part number AH61324, he said, reading off the screen. "It's been discontinued, no longer in production. There are none at the factory warehouse, none at any dealership in the state." The words hit me like a physical blow. Discontinued. It meant my combine was officially an antique, an orphan. The dealership couldn't help me. "So what am I supposed to do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The kid shrugged. "We could sure fix you up with a new combine. Got a brand new 720 on the lot. We're offering great financing terms right now." I walked out without another word. The ride home was the longest of my life. The whole system was designed to push me into a corner, to force me into debt, to make me become Dale Bishop. It felt like the walls were closing in. That night, I sat in my workshop, the broken shaft laid out on the concrete floor like a corpse. I stared at it for hours, the smell of cold steel filling the air. I could sell the combine for scrap. I could take what little savings I had and use it as a down payment on a newer used machine, something with parts that were still available. It would mean taking out a loan. It would mean breaking the one rule my father had lived by. It would mean the banker would finally have his chain around my neck. Or I could fix it. I looked at the clean, crystalline break in the steel. It was a simple fracture. The shaft itself was just a long piece of high-tensile steel. I had a welder. I had a lathe. I had a forge. My grandfather had been a blacksmith before he was a farmer. Some of his tools still hung on the wall, silent and patient. The idea was insane. Welding a high-stress, high-speed shaft like that was next to impossible. If it wasn't perfectly straight, it would vibrate itself to pieces. If the weld wasn't strong enough, it would snap again, probably doing even more damage the next time. Everyone would say it couldn't be done. And that's exactly why I had to try. It was more than a repair now. It was a declaration of war against the whole idea of a disposable world, against the notion that the only solution was to buy a new one. For the next 3 days, my workshop became a sanctuary and a torture chamber. I fired up the old forge, its bellows groaning like an ancient beast taking a breath. I carefully ground a V-notch into both broken ends of the shaft. Then, using my grandfather's heaviest anvil and a set of calipers, I began the painstaking process. I heated the steel, welded a small section, then used the lathe to check for straightness, tapping it with a hammer, reheating and rewelding. It was a slow, agonizing dance of fire, steel, and measurement. I worked by feel, by the sound of the metal, by a sixth sense passed down from my father. On the fourth day, it was done. The shaft was one piece again, a dark, ugly weld scarring its middle. It was straight. To within 1,000th of an inch, I had also managed to hammer the bent straw walkers back into shape and weld a patch over the hole in the combine side panel. Reassembly was another 2 days of grease, sweat, and curses. Finally, late on a Saturday afternoon, with the sun low in the sky and the threat of rain on the wind, it was time. Martha stood by the barn, her arms crossed, her face a mask of worry. I climbed into the cab, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The old 239 diesel engine turned over, caught, and settled into its familiar, rumbling idle. So far, so good. My hand trembled as I reached for the separator engagement lever. I pulled it back slowly. The belts tightened, the chains clattered, and the whole machine began to shake and roar. I listened, every nerve ending on fire, for the sound of a fatal vibration, for the shriek of failing metal. There was nothing, just the normal, deafening symphony of a working combine. The shaft was holding. I engaged the header, put the machine in gear, and eased it forward into the standing corn. The snout lifted the stalks, the reel swept them into the auger, and the familiar thumping sound of corn ears being stripped from the stalk filled the cab. I looked back at the spout. Golden kernels of corn were pouring into the grain tank. I had done it. I had stared into the abyss of obsolescence and spit in its eye. As I made my first pass down the field, I saw Dale Bishop standing by the fence, watching me. He wasn't smiling. He just stood there, a dark silhouette against the setting sun, as my old, resurrected machine did the one thing he thought it never would again. It worked. The harvest of '78 was a good one. Prices were still high, and the weather cooperated. I got my crops in, paid my property taxes, and put a little more money in the bank. On the surface, everything was booming. Dale Bishop bought another 160 acres and a second new semi-truck to haul his grain. The dealership in town sold a record number of new tractors. The headlines in the Farm Journal promised a golden age of American agriculture. But underneath it all, things were starting to feel wrong. The price of diesel fuel had nearly doubled in 2 years. Fertilizer costs were through the roof. The interest rate on my savings account, which had been a steady 5% for as long as I could remember, had jumped to 7, then 9. The man on the radio said it was something called inflation. He said the government was going to have to do something to stop it. One afternoon, I was at the co-op picking up a few bags of seed for a cover crop when I overheard the manager, Tom, talking to one of the younger farmers. "The bank turned me down," the young man said, his voice laced with panic. "Said my debt-to-asset ratio was too high. How am I supposed to buy seed for next spring if they won't give me an operating loan?" "They're tightening up, son," Tom said, shaking his head. "That new fella at the Federal Reserve, Volcker, he's talking about jacking up the prime rate, squeezing the money supply to fight inflation." I didn't know much about the Federal Reserve, but I knew what squeezing meant. It meant the easy money was about to dry up. Dale Bishop seemed oblivious. He was holding court by the coffee machine, bragging about the price he'd locked in for his soybeans. "Forward contracting," he announced to anyone who would listen. "It's the way of the future. You guys waiting to sell on the cash market are going to get left in the dust." He seemed bigger than ever, puffed up with success. But I saw something else in his eyes that day. A flicker of desperation, a frantic energy. He was like a man on a treadmill, running faster and faster, just to stay in the same place. His mountain of debt required a mountain of income to service it. The slightest drop in prices or rise in interest rates, and the whole thing would come crashing down. As I drove home, I passed the Miller farm, the one that had been sold at auction 4 years earlier. Bishop had bulldozed the old farmhouse and barns. All that was left was a flat, empty field, indistinguishable from the hundreds of other acres he now farmed. It was more efficient that way, I supposed. But it felt like a piece of the county's soul had been scraped away. That fall, the signs became undeniable. The price of corn softened, then dropped 20 cents in a week. An early frost damaged a portion of the soybean crop, and the radio was filled with grim news. Interest rates were at 12%. Then 15. There were whispers of farm foreclosures in Iowa and Nebraska. The week before Christmas, 1978, I saw the notice tacked to the bulletin board at the post office. It was a foreclosure announcement. The bank was auctioning off the equipment and land of a family over in the next township. It was the first one in our county since the Depression. A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. It was starting. The chain my father had warned me about was being pulled tight all across the heartland. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was only the beginning. The winter of '79 was coming, and it was going to be a long, cold one. The winter of '79 was a brittle, quiet thing. The snow came early and stayed late, a clean white sheet thrown over a landscape of anxiety. That first foreclosure notice was like a single cough in a crowded church. It broke the silence and made everyone shift uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly aware of the sickness in the air. The talk at the co-op turned from crop prices to interest rates. Men who had once boasted about their new lines of credit now spoke in hushed tones about operating loans and variable rates that were climbing like a fever. The spring of 1980 broke late, and it brought no relief. The rain simply stopped. May was dry. June was a furnace. By July, the sky was a pale, washed-out blue, empty of clouds, and the sun beat down with a merciless intensity. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high and dark green, was stunted and pale, its leaves curling inward during the day as if in prayer for a single drop of water. The soybean leaves were flipped over, showing their silvery undersides, a sure sign of severe stress. The air was filled with the constant, shimmering haze of heat rising from the baked fields. I did what I could. I cultivated my corn with the old 4020, stirring the dust to create a mulch that would hopefully conserve what little moisture was left in the soil. The work was punishing. The steel seat of the tractor was hot enough to fry an egg on, and the heat from the engine washed over me in waves, but my costs were low. My fuel tank was my biggest expense, not an interest payment that grew larger every month. Dale Bishop's operation, however, ran on a torrent of cash. His big four-wheel drive Steiger drank diesel like a thirsty giant. The massive irrigation rigs he'd installed on 2 of his best quarters ran day and night, sucking water from the aquifer and spraying it in huge, wasteful arcs that seemed to evaporate before they even hit the ground. His electricity bill for the pumps alone had to be astronomical. One blistering afternoon in early August, I was replacing a bearing on my hay rake when I saw a cloud of dust coming down the road. It was the service truck from the International Harvester dealership. It turned into Bishop's Lane. An hour later, it came back out, followed by Dale's Lincoln. They were heading toward town. I didn't think much of it until the next day, when I saw the red monster, his 1460 axial flow combine, sitting silent in his machine shed as the service truck returned. 2 days later, I ran into one of the mechanics from the dealership when I was picking up some hydraulic fluid. "What's going on with Bishop's combine?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The mechanic, a young man named Billy, whose father I'd gone to school with, wiped his greasy hands on a rag. "Hydrostat transmission went out," he said, lowering his voice. "Completely shot. We pulled it, but the main pump housing is cracked. Have to get a whole new unit from the factory in East Moline." I whistled softly. The hydrostatic drive was the heart of a modern combine's propulsion system. It was complex, powerful, and incredibly expensive. Not something a farmer could fix himself in his own shop. "What's that going to set him back?" Billy shook his head. "With labor? He won't get much change back from $10,000, and the part's on back order. We told him it'll be 2 weeks, maybe 3, if we're lucky." 3 weeks, in late August, with the harvest just around the corner. A 3-week delay could be a death sentence. The first cracks in Bishop's empire were beginning to show. He'd built a magnificent machine, but it was so complex and so tightly wound that a single broken part could bring the whole thing to a halt. He was completely dependent on the dealership, on the supply chain, on a flow of cash he needed to pay for it all. My old John Deere 95, with the shaft I had welded myself, sat in my shed, ready to go. It might be slow and clumsy, but I was dependent on no one but myself. The drought broke in late August, with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened what was left of the corn and shelled out the soybeans on the stalk. The harvest of 1980 was a catastrophe. Yields were half of what they should have been. And the prices? They collapsed. President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union, and with our biggest customer suddenly gone, the market was flooded. I saw Dale at the grain elevator in October. He looked like a ghost. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes were bloodshot, and the confident swagger was gone. He was arguing with the manager, his voice tight with desperation. "I can't sell at that price. My forward contract was for $1 more." "The contract had an act of God clause, Dale," the manager said patiently. "The embargo qualifies. I'm sorry. This is the price." Dale saw me watching, and his face hardened. He walked away without another word, the weight of a crumbling kingdom on his shoulders. He was selling his meager crop for less than it cost him to produce it. And all the while, the interest on his loans was compounding, ticking away like a time bomb. The prime rate had just hit 18%. His debt wasn't just a chain anymore, it was a hungry beast, and it was eating him alive. The winter that followed was grim. The auction notices on the post office bulletin board multiplied. They weren't just for the unlucky or the unwell anymore. They were for good farmers, hard workers who had followed the advice of the experts. Get big or get out. Leverage your assets. Spend money to make money. It had all been a lie. The farm crisis of the early 1980s wasn't a sudden crash. It was a slow, grinding suffocation. The interest rates, pushed by the Federal Reserve to fight inflation, climbed to an unthinkable 21%. Land values, which had been the collateral for all those massive loans, plummeted. Farmers who had been millionaires on paper 2 years earlier were suddenly bankrupt. The bankers who had been so eager to lend money, who had encouraged the expansion, now turned into cold-eyed executioners. Their letters started with, "Your loan is in default," and ended with foreclosure dates. It was a time of terrible silence. The phones stopped ringing. Neighbors who used to wave from their tractors now stared straight ahead, their faces grim masks of shame and fear. You'd see a family at church on Sunday, and on Tuesday, their house would be empty, a U-Haul truck having spirited them away in the dead of night. Dale Bishop held on longer than most. He was too big to fail, people thought. He sold off one of the semi-trucks. Then the Steiger tractor disappeared from his yard. Rumor was he'd sold it to a big outfit in Texas, taking a huge loss just to get some cash to appease the bank. His downfall came at his own auction in the fall of '82. It was on a cold, grey November day, the kind where the sky is the colour of lead and the wind cuts right through your coat. The scene was a haunting echo of the Miller sale 8 years prior, but so much worse. The crowd was bigger, filled not with hopeful buyers, but with the ghosts of the county's failed farms. Men stood with their hands in their pockets, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and a terrifying recognition that it could have been them. All of Bishop's gleaming red machinery was lined up, the paint already starting to fade, the tires caked with the mud of his last, desperate harvest. The International 1460 Combine, the one that had cost him a fortune to repair, sold for less than half of what he owed on it. The auctioneer's chant felt less like a sales pitch and more like a funeral rite, selling off the pieces of a man's life, one lot at a time. I stood at the back, just as I had all those years ago. I wasn't there to gloat. There was no victory in watching a man be destroyed, even a man like Dale. It was a tragedy for him, for his family, for all of us. I saw him standing near the house, his wife beside him, holding his hand. He looked 20 years older. The fire was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, empty stare. While the machinery was being sold, I walked into the farm shop. It was immaculate, organized, with tools that still looked new. He'd had the best of everything. But there, on a workbench in the corner, I saw it. An old, greasy injector pump from a John Deere 4020. It was caked with grime, half disassembled, with tiny springs and washers laid out on a clean rag. He'd been trying to rebuild it himself. The man who had mocked me for doing the exact same thing had, in the end, been forced to try and save himself with his own 2 hands. But it was too late. He didn't have the years of practice, the deep, ingrained knowledge that comes from a lifetime of making do. He had only known how to sign a check. My survival was quiet, almost invisible. While the storm raged around me, I was in the eye of it. My world hadn't changed. I still got up before dawn. I still patched my own tires and welded my own broken equipment. Martha and I had a huge garden, and she spent the summers canning and preserving, our shelves groaning with food. We didn't have mortgage payments or machinery loans. Our only major expense was property tax, and the money from my small, debt-free harvest was more than enough to cover it. The John Deere 95, with its welded main shaft, brought in 3 more harvests without a single major breakdown. It became a symbol for me, a monument to a different way of thinking. It wasn't about how fast you could go. It was about being able to keep going at all. I even picked up a little custom work. A neighbor, whose new combine had been repossessed, asked if I'd cut his last 40 acres of beans. I did it for a fair price, and he paid me in cash. The old 95, the museum piece, was earning money while the new ones were being hauled away on flatbed trucks. The irony was so thick I could taste it. The last item to be sold at Dale Bishop's auction was the land. It was sold in parcels. When the auctioneer announced the South 80, the piece of ground bordering my farm, a hush fell over the crowd. This was the first piece Dale had bought in his quest for an empire, the one he had bragged to me about all those years ago. "What am I bid for this prime 80 acres of level black dirt?" the auctioneer began. The banker, a grim-faced man in a suit, started the bidding. $30,000. The price was a crime. 8 years ago, that land was worth twice that. The crowd was silent. No one had any money. No one could get a loan. The bank was just buying it back for pennies on the dollar. I felt a surge of anger, cold and hard. Anger at the bankers, at the experts, at the whole broken system. I thought of my father. I thought of the cash I had saved, year after year, tucked away in that savings account, earning interest while Dale's debt was devouring him. I took a breath and stepped forward. My voice, when it came out, was louder and clearer than I expected. 35,000. Every head in the crowd turned to look at me. The banker's eyes widened in surprise. He conferred with another man in a suit, then nodded at the auctioneer. 40,000, the banker countered, his voice sharp. 45, I said immediately, without hesitation. A murmur went through the crowd. Silas Blackwood, the man who never borrowed a dime, was bidding. The banker looked irritated. He was used to these things being formalities. 50,000. This was it. This was the number I had in my head. It was almost everything I had saved over 20 years of careful, frugal farming. It was the price of a dream. $60,000, I said, my voice like stone. I was betting the farm, my farm, on this. It was a bluff. I only had 55 in the bank, but I said it with a conviction that I didn't feel. The banker stared at me. He saw the look in my eyes. He saw a man who wasn't bidding with the bank's money, but with the sum of his life's work. He saw a man who would not be denied. He shook his head slightly at the auctioneer. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel cracking through the cold air. "To Silas Blackwood, for $60,000. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a profound, bone-deep sense of vindication. I had not only survived, I had prevailed. Not by being bigger or faster, but by being freer. I walked over to the auctioneer's table to sign the papers and write the check, my hand steady. As I finished, I saw Dale. He was walking toward his car, a broken man. I intercepted him. "Dale," I said quietly. He stopped but didn't look at me. "Come to rub it in, Silas?" he asked, his voice thick with defeat. "No," I said. "I came to tell you I'm sorry for how things turned out." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. I took out all the cash I had, about $200. "Here, for gas. For you and your family." He finally looked at me, his eyes swimming with tears. He was seeing me for the first time, not as a rival or a relic, but as a neighbor. He slowly took the money. "Why, Silas?" "Because we're from the same place," I said, "and this place is hard enough without us turning on each other." He nodded, unable to speak, and got into his car. I never saw him again. I heard he moved up to Minnesota, got a job managing a big corporate farm. I hope he found some peace. The years after the crisis were quiet. The county healed slowly, like a man recovering from a long illness. The farms that were left were smaller, more cautious. The talk at the co-op was about soil conservation and managing input costs, not about buying the latest and greatest machine. My quiet, stubborn ways were no longer seen as foolish. Men would stop by my workshop, asking for advice on how to repair a piece of equipment, how to get by without a loan from the bank. The banker, a new man now, treated me with a reverence usually reserved for the town mayor. I hadn't gotten rich, but I had endured. And in that landscape of ruin, endurance was the only kind of wealth that mattered. Martha and I grew old on that farm. We watched the seasons turn, year after year. The South 80 became the best piece of ground I had, and every time I plowed it with my old 40-20, I felt the deep satisfaction of ownership, paid for not with a banker's pen, but with a lifetime of sweat and patience. One sunny afternoon in my 70th year, I was out in the shed, greasing the bearings on the John Deere 95. My grandson, Ben, who was about 10 years old, was with me, holding the flashlight. His hands were small and clean, so different from mine. "Grandpa," he asked, his voice echoing in the cavern of the empty grain tank, "why do we keep this old thing? Dad says the new combines have computers and GPS. This one is just old." I stopped turning the grease gun and looked at him. I wiped my hands on a red rag, the grease leaving dark stains that would never come out. "Ben," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder, "let me tell you about this combine. This old piece of iron is more than just a machine. It's a lesson. Back when your dad was about your age, there was a terrible time here, a winter that lasted for years. Men lost everything they had because they owed money on machines that were bigger and shinier than this one." I pointed to the ugly, dark weld on the main separator shaft. "See that scar? I made that. I made it with fire and a hammer because the company didn't make the part anymore. They wanted me to throw this machine away and buy a new one. They wanted me to owe them money." I looked him straight in the eye. This combine taught me the most important lesson there is. It's not about what you have, it's about what you owe. Debt is a chain, son. You can't always see it, but the man on the other end is always holding it. This old machine, this is freedom." Ben looked from my face to the old combine, his eyes wide with a new understanding. He reached out and touched the faded green paint, a look of reverence on his face. In that moment, I knew the lesson had been passed on. My legacy wasn't in the number of acres I owned, but in the wisdom I could leave behind. I finished my work, and we walked out of the shed into the warm afternoon sun. I looked out across my fields, the land my grandfather broke, the land I had saved. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the corn, a sound like a quiet promise. I was just a farmer, a stubborn old man who believed in the wisdom of his father. But I had held on. I had kept the farm. And in the end, that was everything.